What would you do if the world's richest man was drowning before your eyes? For 72-year-old Henry Carter, the answer was simple: save him, no questions asked. And what happened the very next day would turn Henry's life upside down. A story of courage, kindness, and the power of second chances. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The biting cold of an Austin winter seeped through the cracks of the old bridge like a silent predator, gnawing at anything warm and alive beneath it. The bridge served as a grim shelter for Henry Carter, 72, and his wife Mary, 68. For the past 7 years, it had been their home, a sanctuary of sorts, though it offered no solace from the harsh reality of their lives. Henry crouched beside a small fire he'd carefully crafted from scavenged wood and old newspapers. The flames flickered weakly against the unforgiving wind, their warmth struggling to fend off the chill. He adjusted his fraying coat, its patched sleeves a testament to years of wear and survival. Nearby, Mary lay curled up on their makeshift bed, a pallet of wooden boards layered with tattered blankets. She coughed softly, a sound that echoed in Henry's chest like a hammer striking an anvil. Henry turned toward her, his weathered face etched with concern. Mary's health had been deteriorating for years. The mounting medical bills for her heart condition had cost them everything: their home, their savings, and Henry's pride. Despite his best efforts, the system had ground them down until they were left with nothing but each other. "Are you warm enough, Mary?" Henry asked, his voice low and raspy. Mary offered him a weak smile, her gray-blue eyes sparkling with a quiet resilience. "I'm fine, Henry. Just a little tired, that's all." But Henry knew better. He saw the weight of the struggle in her eyes, the way her body fought for every breath. Each of her coughs was a reminder of his helplessness, a reminder of how far they had fallen from the life they once knew. "Rest, sweetheart," Henry said gently, throwing another scrap of wood onto the fire. The flames danced briefly before settling into a fragile flicker. As Mary drifted into an uneasy sleep, Henry sat back against the cold concrete wall of the bridge. His thoughts wandered to the past, to the days when he was a proud shipyard mechanic and Mary was a nurse. Their love had carried them through so much: the early struggles, the joy of raising a family, and even the sorrow of losing a child. But nothing had prepared them for the financial ruin that came with Mary's illness. Henry clenched his fists, his calloused hands trembling with frustration. He hated the feeling of being powerless, of watching the woman he loved slip further away with each passing day. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp noise, a distant cry for help. It pierced the stillness of the night, startling him to his feet. He glanced toward the source of the sound, his heart pounding. The cry came again, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the river near the docks. Henry hesitated at the threshold of his meager shelter, torn between staying with Mary and investigating the distant cry. The icy wind howled like a predator, cutting through the layers of his threadbare jacket. He cast one last glance at Mary, who lay curled on the pallet, her fragile chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The sight tugged at his heart, but the cry came again. Desperate, urgent, a plea that refused to be ignored. Something deep within him stirred, a primal instinct that defied his years and weariness. Grabbing the battered flashlight from his belongings, he whispered, "I'll be right back, Mary," though she remained sound asleep. Steeling himself, he stepped into the biting cold, the frosted ground crunching beneath his boots. The night was oppressively dark, with the moon hidden behind a thick veil of clouds. Henry's flashlight cut through the void, its weak beam illuminating the cracked asphalt and tufts of frozen grass that lined the path toward the riverbank. Each gust of wind pierced him like a dagger, but the cries grew louder, compelling him to quicken his pace. "Hold on!" he shouted into the night, though he doubted the voice could carry over the roar of the river. His breath came in visible puffs, each step heavier than the last, as he neared the source of the commotion. When he finally reached the water's edge, the scene before him froze him in place. A figure was thrashing wildly in the icy currents, their arms flailing as the river's relentless pull dragged them toward the deeper, faster-moving waters. The man's desperate cries punctuated the chaotic splashes, but they were growing weaker, swallowed by the cold and exhaustion. Henry's grip tightened on the flashlight, his mind racing. At 72, his body was no longer the tool of resilience it had once been. The years of hard labor at the shipyard had left his joints stiff and his muscles weary. Yet, as he stared at the man fighting for his life, he felt the unmistakable pull of responsibility. The voice of his late father echoed in his mind. If you can help, you do it. No excuses. Without a second thought, Henry dropped the flashlight onto the muddy bank. Its faint glow created a halo around him as he yanked off his coat and kicked off his heavy boots. The river before him was a black, swirling abyss, but fear was a luxury he didn't have time for. "Hang on!" he bellowed, his voice strong despite the freezing air. He took a deep breath, bracing himself, and plunged into the frigid water. The cold hit him like 1,000 knives, shocking his body into a state of hyper-awareness. The icy water seeped through his clothes, tightening around his chest, and making every movement feel like lifting lead. He gasped as the cold stole the breath from his lungs, but he forced his arms to move, cutting through the current with powerful strokes. The river was unforgiving, its current pulling at him with a relentless force, as if trying to drag him into its depths. Every wave that crashed against him felt like a blow, sapping his strength. His limbs screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward, fueled by determination and the faint hope that he could still make a difference. As he neared the struggling figure, he shouted again, his voice hoarse and raw. "I'm coming! Just hold on!" The man's head bobbed above the surface, his gasps audible even over the roar of the water. Henry's heart ached at the sight. This stranger fighting for life against a force so much greater than himself. With one final surge of effort, Henry reached him, grabbing onto the man's arm with a grip that defied his age. "I've got you!" Henry shouted, his voice firm despite the exhaustion clawing at his body. The man clung to him desperately, his nails digging into Henry's shoulders as if he were holding on to the last shred of hope. Together, they fought against the current, Henry pulling the man toward shore with every ounce of strength he could muster. The swim back to the riverbank felt like an eternity. Every muscle in Henry's body burned, his lungs screaming for air. The weight of the man in his grasp added to the river's resistance, but Henry refused to let go. His mind flashed with memories of Mary, of the promises they had made to always stand by one another. He couldn't fail. Not now, not when someone's life depended on him. "Almost there," Henry muttered, though his words were swallowed by the rushing water. He focused on the faint glow of the flashlight on the shore, a beacon guiding him to safety. When his feet finally touched the muddy bottom, relief washed over him. With a final burst of energy, he dragged the man onto the bank, collapsing beside him in a heap. His chest heaved as he gulped in air, his body trembling uncontrollably from the cold. The man beside him coughed violently, water spewing from his mouth as he rolled onto his side. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his expensive suit clung to his body like a second skin. Henry turned his head to look at him, his breath shallow but steady. "You okay?" Henry managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The man nodded weakly, his teeth chattering so violently that he couldn't speak. Henry's eyes fell on his face, illuminated faintly by the flashlight lying nearby. There was something familiar about him, but Henry couldn't quite place it. "Let's get you somewhere warm," Henry said, forcing himself to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, but he extended a hand toward the man. After a moment of hesitation, the man grasped it, his grip feeble but grateful. Together, they stumbled away from the riverbank, the wind biting at their soaked clothes. The journey back to the bridge was slow, each step a battle against the cold and exhaustion. Henry could feel his own body weakening, but the thought of Mary waiting for him gave him the strength to keep moving. When they reached the shelter of the bridge, Henry carefully helped the man down onto the driest spot he could find. The meager fire he had left behind was still flickering faintly, offering a glimmer of warmth against the bitter wind. Mary stirred on the wooden pallet, her frail form shifting under the tattered blankets. "Henry," she called softly, her voice weak but laced with worry. "What happened? Who's that?" "I found him in the river," Henry replied, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Poor guy was drowning. We need to get him warm." Without hesitation, Mary sat up despite her obvious discomfort. "Bring him here," she said, her nurse's instincts springing to life. Her concern for others had always outweighed her own struggles, a quality Henry admired deeply. Henry gently guided the man closer to the fire and removed his soaking jacket. The man's teeth chattered violently. His lips blew from the cold. His clothes were expensive, a tailored suit that clung to his body, now ruined by the river. The stark contrast between the man's attire and their modest surroundings wasn't lost on Henry, but he pushed the thought aside. "Here," Mary said, handing over the blanket she had been using. "Wrap this around him." Henry hesitated. "Mary, you need this." She shook her head firmly. "He won't make it through the night if he doesn't warm up." "I'll be fine." Reluctantly, Henry draped the blanket over the man's shoulders and leaned him closer to the fire. "You're lucky we heard you," he said, his voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. "What were you doing out there anyway?" The man coughed violently, his body racked with shivers. "Testing. A project," he managed to say between gasps. "Boat malfunctioned. Current was stronger than I thought." Henry frowned, his sharp eyes catching the man's discomfort. "You shouldn't be testing anything in weather like this. What kind of project puts you in a suit like that on a river in the dead of night?" The man didn't answer right away. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, his gaze fixed on the fire. After a long moment, he said, "It's a work thing. I was testing an automated boat design for SpaceX." The name struck Henry like a jolt of lightning. SpaceX. The tech giant that had been dominating the headlines for years. The pieces clicked together in his mind as he studied the man's face. Despite the mud and exhaustion, the features were unmistakable. "You're," Henry began, his voice trailing off. He didn't want to make assumptions, but it was hard to ignore the realization dawning on him. The man nodded weakly. "Elon Musk." Henry blinked, momentarily stunned. He had heard the name countless times on the radio, at the homeless shelter, or through passing conversations on the street. Elon Musk, one of the wealthiest, most influential men in the world, was sitting here, under his bridge, wrapped in his wife's blanket. "Well," Henry said, recovering his composure, "guess even billionaires need saving sometimes." A flicker of a smile crossed Elon's lips despite his chattering teeth. "Apparently," he muttered. "Thank you for not hesitating." "It's what anyone should do," Henry replied simply. "You needed help. That's all that mattered." Mary, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "You're lucky he found you," she said gently, her voice still steady despite her frailty. "Not many people would risk their lives for a stranger." Elon looked at her, then back at Henry. "Why did you?" he asked, his tone genuinely curious. Henry shrugged, his rugged features softening. "My wife here. She's always said the same thing. If you can help, you should. Doesn't matter who it is or what they've got. Kindness doesn't cost a thing." Elon fell silent, his eyes fixed on the fire. The crackling flames reflected in his gaze, and for a moment, he looked less like a tech mogul and more like a man wrestling with the gravity of his situation. "Let's get you through the night," Mary said gently. "You'll need your strength in the morning." Elon nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around himself as the fire's warmth began to seep into his bones. Henry sat down beside Mary, his body aching from the cold, but his heart oddly light. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but for now, they had done their part. The faint glow of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the bridge above, casting pale light on the humble refuge beneath. The fire had dwindled to glowing embers, but it still offered a trace of warmth against the lingering cold. Elon Musk sat close to the remnants of the fire, wrapped in the worn blanket Mary had given him. His once pristine suit was now stiff with dried mud, his hair disheveled, and his expression contemplative. Mary rested against the wall of the bridge, her breath steady but shallow. Despite her frail state, she had insisted on staying awake to make sure Elon was warm and settled. Henry, sitting across from Elon, rubbed his aching hands together, his rough palms still raw from the icy river. "You don't need to keep watching me like I'm some kind of rare bird," Elon said finally, his voice carrying a trace of humor. "I'm not as fragile as I look," Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "You'd be surprised how many folks think that before they end up in trouble. Don't worry, though, you'll be fine now." There was a beat of silence before Elon spoke again. "You didn't have to do it, you know, jumping into the river like that, especially at your age." Henry leaned back slightly, his lips curving into a faint smile. "I wasn't going to stand there and watch someone drown. Age doesn't change what's right and wrong. Mary chimed in softly, her voice carrying a warmth that belied her exhaustion. Henry's always been like that. He doesn't think twice when someone needs help. It's one of the reasons I married him. Elon's gaze shifted to Mary, his brows knitting together. And you? You don't seem like the kind of person who should be living under a bridge. Mary's smile was faint but genuine. Life doesn't always give you a choice. Sometimes you just make do. Henry's face grew somber as he looked at his wife. We weren't always here, he began. Used to have a little house, a good life. I worked at the shipyard for nearly 40 years. Mary was a nurse, one of the best they had at the hospital downtown. Elon's curiosity deepened. What happened? Henry sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the memory. Mary got sick. Heart problems. The bills piled up faster than we could handle. I did everything I could, took extra shifts, sold what we didn't need, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, we lost the house. Been here ever since. There was no bitterness in Henry's tone, just a quiet acceptance that made his words all the more powerful. Life takes more than it gives sometimes, he said, his voice steady. But we do what we can. Elon nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. That's not something most people would say in your position. Most would be angry. Henry shrugged. Anger doesn't fix anything, and it sure doesn't make you feel better. Mary added gently, we've learned to hold on to what matters, each other. That's more than enough most days. The conversation lulled, the quiet crackle of the dying fire filling the space between them. Elon's gaze dropped to the ground, his mind clearly elsewhere. After a moment, he looked up again, his expression softening. You're remarkable people, he said quietly. I don't know many who would do what you've done tonight, what you've done your whole lives. Henry gave a modest smile, brushing off the compliment. We're just ordinary folks trying to get by, same as anyone else. Elon reached into his pocket, pulling out a slightly crumpled business card. He held it out to Henry. Come to this address tomorrow morning. Ask for me. I owe you more than you think. Henry hesitated, looking at the card but making no move to take it. We don't want charity, he said firmly. We've made it this far on our own. We'll be fine. It's not charity, Elon replied, his voice steady. It's a chance, one you've more than earned. Mary touched Henry's arm lightly, her eyes meeting his. Henry, maybe this is the miracle we've been waiting for. Henry glanced between her and Elon, the conflict evident in his face. Finally, he reached out and took the card, his calloused fingers closing around it carefully. All right, he said quietly. I'll come. The weight of the card in Henry's hand felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the possibility of something far greater than he dared to hope for. As the sun began to rise over the city, the three of them sat together in the quiet, sharing an unspoken understanding that their lives had been forever changed by the events of the night. The next morning came with an air of both anticipation and unease. Henry Carter stood under the weak glow of a street lamp, clutching the crumpled business card Elon Musk had given him the night before. His hands, rough and scarred from decades of labor, trembled slightly. Not from the cold, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Beside him, Mary watched with quiet encouragement, her frail smile carrying a strength that belied her physical state. You've got this, Henry, she said softly. Whatever happens, just remember, you've already done more than anyone could ask. Henry nodded, her words bolstering his resolve. He leaned down to kiss her forehead before setting off toward the nearest bus stop. Mary had insisted on staying behind, her health too fragile for the long trip. As the bus rumbled down the street, Henry clutched his ticket tightly, his mind racing with questions. What exactly was Elon Musk planning? Was this truly an opportunity or just a polite gesture? The city buzzed with its usual morning chaos as Henry stepped off the bus in front of SpaceX headquarters. The building towered above him, its sleek design a stark contrast to the gritty streets he had walked for years. He adjusted his collar, the faint smell of laundry soap clinging to the old flannel shirt he'd scrubbed clean with his last quarters. As he approached the entrance, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. The polished glass doors reflected a man who looked out of place, weathered, worn, and undeniably nervous. He hesitated, staring at the business card in his hand, before finally stepping inside. The receptionist greeted him with a polite, practiced smile. "Good morning, sir. How can I help you?" "I'm here to see Elon Musk," Henry said, his voice wavering slightly. He held up the card, feeling a bit ridiculous. "He told me to come." The receptionist's smile didn't falter. "Of course, Mr. Carter. We've been expecting you." She gestured toward a nearby elevator. "Take this to the 10th floor. Someone will meet you there." Henry blinked in surprise. "You've been expecting me?" "Yes, sir," she replied warmly. "Mr. Musk personally notified us. You're in good hands." The elevator ride felt like an eternity. As the floors ticked by, Henry adjusted his shirt and tried to steady his breathing. When the doors finally opened, he was greeted by a young woman with a clipboard and a friendly demeanor. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Sarah from the HR department. Please follow me." Henry shook her hand, his grip firm but hesitant. As they walked through the bright, bustling corridors of SpaceX, he couldn't help but marvel at the state-of-the-art facilities. Engineers and technicians worked intently, their discussions a mix of jargon and excitement. The energy in the building was palpable, and for the first time in years, Henry felt a flicker of something he hadn't known in a long while: curiosity. Sarah led him into a spacious conference room, where Elon Musk sat at the head of a long glass table. Dressed in a crisp blazer, he looked every bit the visionary entrepreneur the world knew him as. But as he stood to greet Henry, his demeanor was warm and genuine. "Henry," Elon said with a warm smile, rising from his chair and extending his hand. "I'm glad you came." Henry hesitated for a fraction of a second before accepting the handshake. Elon's grip was firm, but not overwhelming, a balance that spoke of both confidence and humility. Henry's calloused hand, marked by years of labor, felt rough against Elon's polished palm, a contrast that didn't escape Henry's notice. "Didn't think I had much choice," Henry admitted, his voice tinged with a mix of honesty and self-consciousness. "Your invitation was hard to ignore," Elon chuckled, gesturing to the seat across from him. "I can imagine. Please, have a seat." Henry lowered himself into the plush leather chair, his movements cautious. The conference room was modern and immaculate, its walls adorned with sleek designs and futuristic models of rockets and spacecraft. The environment felt alien to him, like stepping into another world, one he wasn't sure he belonged in. His fingers instinctively brushed against the frayed edge of his shirt cuff, a habit he'd picked up when nerves threatened to overwhelm him. As Henry settled in, Elon leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His gaze was direct, earnest. "First, let me thank you again for what you did last night," he began. "You didn't just save me, you reminded me of something I'd forgotten, the power of simple human kindness." Henry shifted uncomfortably, his posture stiff. Compliments, especially from someone like Elon Musk, didn't sit easily with him. "I just did what anyone should do," he said gruffly, "nothing more." Elon's eyes softened, his voice steady but insistent. "But it was more, Henry. In a world where people walk past others without a second glance, you didn't hesitate. That means something." Henry's gaze dropped to the polished surface of the table. A part of him wanted to brush off Elon's words, to shrink away from the attention. He wasn't used to being acknowledged like this, especially not after years of feeling invisible. But another part of him, buried deep beneath layers of doubt and hardship, felt a flicker of pride. Elon leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I want to repay that kindness in a way that's meaningful. I'd like to offer you a job here at SpaceX." The words hung in the air like an echo, reverberating in Henry's mind. He blinked, certain he had misheard. "A job?" he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Doing what?" Elon's smile returned, a spark of enthusiasm lighting his features. "We've recently started a project to make our systems and tools more accessible to mechanics and technicians outside the company. Your experience as a shipyard mechanic is exactly what we need to help us identify gaps and create practical solutions." Henry stared at him, his thoughts swirling. A job. The very idea seemed absurd. He was 72 years old, his body worn from decades of hard labor. Doubt crept in, its voice loud and insistent. What could I possibly offer a place like this? "I don't know," he began, his voice faltering. "I'm 72. Most people think I'm past my prime." Elon's expression grew firm, his voice unwavering. I don't believe that. Experience like yours doesn't expire, Henry. It evolves. And you've proven you have not just the skills, but the character we want on our team. Henry's chest tightened as Elon's words sunk in. For so long, he had seen himself through the lens of what he'd lost. His home, his dignity, the steady rhythm of a life he'd worked so hard to build. Accepting this offer felt almost impossible. Could he really fit into a world so different from his own? Could he live up to the expectations of a place like SpaceX? I've been out of work for years, Henry said finally, his voice low. I don't know if I can keep up. The last time I worked on anything like this was before these kids were even born. Henry, Elon said, leaning forward, you don't have to know everything on day one. What matters is that you're here. Your perspective, your experience, it's invaluable. You see the world in ways these kids, as you call them, can't. That's why I need you. Henry swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the window. Outside, the sun glinted off the towering rockets on the SpaceX campus, a testament to human ingenuity. For a moment, he thought of Mary, of her laughter, her unwavering belief in him, even when he'd struggled to believe in himself. Her voice echoed in his mind. Maybe this is the miracle we've been waiting for. Before Henry could respond, a young woman entered the room and placed a folder in front of him. This includes everything you'll need to get started, she explained, her tone professional yet kind. We'll provide temporary housing while you settle in, and your medical benefits will start immediately. Henry's breath caught at the mention of medical benefits. Does that include family? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It does, Elon confirmed. We'll make sure Mary gets the care she needs. The weight of those words hit Henry like a tidal wave. For so long, Mary's health had been a source of constant worry, a burden he had carried silently. The thought of her receiving the treatment she needed, without the shadow of debt looming over them, was almost too much to comprehend. Before Henry could speak, Elon slid an envelope across the table. This, he said softly, is to cover any outstanding medical bills. You've carried that burden long enough. Henry stared at the envelope, his vision blurring as tears welled in his eyes. His hands trembled as he reached for it, the rough skin of his fingers brushing against the smooth paper. For a moment, he was overwhelmed. By gratitude, by disbelief, by the sheer magnitude of what was being offered. Henry closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The voice of doubt still lingered, but it was quieter now, drowned out by the voice of hope. When he opened his eyes, he met Elon's gaze. You didn't just save me, Henry said, his voice cracking. You saved us both. I'll take the job, but not because I need charity. I'll take it because I want to prove you right. Elon's smile was warm, his tone sincere. That's all I could ever ask for, Henry. As Henry left the conference room later that morning, the folder clutched tightly in his hands, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he walked with purpose. The future no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt like something real, something within reach. Henry Carter walked with a sense of purpose. The key card in his pocket felt heavier than it should have, not because of its weight, but because of what it symbolized, a door to a life he thought was long gone. As he approached the modest apartment Elon Musk had arranged for him and Mary, his steps quickened. He was eager to share the news. The apartment complex was a far cry from the bridge they had called home. The building was clean with freshly painted walls and a small garden at the entrance. The manager greeted Henry warmly, handing him a set of keys and explaining the amenities. Henry listened politely, but his mind was on Mary. When he finally opened the door to their new home, Mary was waiting for him. She had insisted on coming early with Sarah's help, determined to make the place feel like theirs before Henry arrived. The small living room was sparsely furnished, but bright, with a vase of fresh flowers sitting on the table. Mary's touch. "Henry!" she exclaimed, her voice filled with warmth and relief. She moved toward him, her steps unsteady, but driven by excitement. Henry wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. "We did it, Mary. We've got a home again." Tears welled in her eyes as she pulled back to look at him. "Tell me everything. How did it go?" Henry guided her to the couch, sitting beside her as he recounted the events of the morning. He described the job Elon had offered, the medical benefits that would cover her treatment, and the envelope that would erase their debt. As he spoke, Mary's face lit up with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Henry," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I told you. Miracles happen. You just have to keep believing." Henry smiled, his rough hand covering hers. "You were right, as always." The next morning, Henry stood in front of the mirror in their new apartment, adjusting the collar of his freshly laundered work shirt. He felt a nervous excitement he hadn't experienced in decades. Mary sat nearby, offering words of encouragement as she sipped her morning tea. "You look sharp," she said with a playful smile. "They won't know what hit them," Henry chuckled. "I just hope I can keep up with all those young engineers. It's been a long time since I worked with tools." Mary's expression softened. "You've got more to offer than you realize. Don't let anyone tell you different." Her words echoed in his mind as he arrived at SpaceX headquarters. This time, he entered with less hesitation, his keycard granting him access to a world he never imagined being a part of. Sarah greeted him in the lobby, her enthusiasm infectious. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," she said, handing him a badge with his name and title, Technical Advisor. "Let me show you to your station." The workshop was bustling with activity, a hive of innovation and problem-solving. Engineers moved between workbenches, testing prototypes and discussing designs. Henry's station was set up near a group working on vehicle maintenance systems. "This is where you'll be working," Sarah explained. "Your input on design improvements for mechanics will be invaluable." Henry took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's get started." As the weeks went by, Henry settled into his new role. His decades of experience in shipyard mechanics proved more relevant than he had anticipated. He quickly identified inefficiencies in the designs and suggested practical solutions, earning the respect of his colleagues. "Mr. Carter," one of the younger engineers said one afternoon, "how did you figure this out so quickly?" Henry chuckled, holding up a wrench. "When you've worked with your hands as long as I have, you learn to see things others might miss. Sometimes it's not about the fancy tools. It's about understanding how they're used." His humble approach and willingness to share his knowledge made him a favorite among the team. Elon Musk occasionally stopped by the workshop, always taking a moment to ask Henry how things were going. Each time, Henry expressed his gratitude, but Elon always responded with the same sentiment. "You earned this, Henry. I'm just glad we found you." With the medical benefits in place, Mary began receiving the treatment she desperately needed. The doctors were optimistic, and her health steadily improved. Henry made it a point to attend every appointment with her, sitting by her side and holding her hand as they faced each step together. One afternoon, as they walked out of the clinic, Mary turned to Henry with a smile. "You know, I feel like I'm finally breathing again, not just physically, but in here." She placed a hand over her heart. Henry squeezed her hand gently. "You're not the only one. Feels like we've got our lives back." Word of Henry's story spread throughout the company. His coworkers were inspired not just by his expertise, but by the humility and resilience he brought to the workplace. Elon, moved by Henry's journey, decided to expand the initiative, creating a program to hire veterans and older workers who had fallen on hard times. The program was met with overwhelming success, with dozens of skilled workers finding a second chance through SpaceX. Henry became a mentor within the program, sharing his story with new hires and reminding them of the value they still carried. "Sometimes," he told a group one afternoon, "all it takes is someone to believe in you. Just for a moment. That's all the time you need to start believing in yourself again." Life for Henry Carter and his wife Mary had taken a dramatic turn. The modest apartment Elon Musk had provided felt like a sanctuary compared to the harsh realities they had endured for years. Its warm walls, clean furnishings, and the scent of fresh paint filled Henry with a quiet gratitude each time he returned home from work. Mary, too, was beginning to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. The burden of mounting debt and the gnawing fear of her worsening health had lifted, replaced by a cautious optimism. With every doctor's appointment, the progress became more evident. Her energy improved, her laughter returned, and she no longer hesitated to share her dreams of what their renewed future might hold. One evening, as Henry sat at their small kitchen table, Mary brought over 2 mugs of steaming tea. She eased into the chair across from him, her smile soft but genuine. "You look tired," she said, studying him with the gentle concern she always had. "How's the new role treating you?" Henry chuckled, taking a sip of tea. "It's good, Busy, but good. Those engineers, they're brilliant, but sometimes they forget the basics. I spent half the day explaining how to make a tool more accessible to the mechanics who'll actually use it. Mary smiled, her eyes sparkling with pride. They're lucky to have you, Henry. You've always been good at making things work, no matter how tough it gets. Her words warmed him more than the tea ever could. He reached across the table to take her hand, the lines of age and hardship fading in the shared moment of peace. Wouldn't have made it this far without you, he said simply. You kept me going, Mary, even when I thought there wasn't a way forward. Mary's grip tightened, her voice soft. We kept each other going, Henry, and we'll keep doing it. At SpaceX, Henry's presence had become a cornerstone of the new program to hire veterans and older workers. Each day he worked alongside a growing team of individuals who, like him, had been given a second chance. Some were hesitant at first, their confidence eroded by years of hardship. But Henry had a way of drawing them out, sharing his own story and showing them that it was never too late to rebuild. One afternoon, Henry stood in the workshop with a group of new hires, all of them veterans with extensive mechanical experience, but little hope for the future. You see this wrench? Henry said, holding up the tool. Looks simple, right? But in the hands of someone who knows how to use it, it can fix just about anything. It's the same with you. Life might have made you feel like you've been left behind, but all that experience you've got, it's still there. You just need to pick it back up. One of the younger men, a former aircraft mechanic, spoke up. But what if we're not as sharp as we used to be? What if we mess up? Henry smiled, his voice steady. Messing up is part of the process. What matters is that you're here, willing to try. That's what gets the gears turning again. The room was quiet for a moment, then filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Henry's words carried a weight that only someone who had lived through the struggle could deliver. Mary, meanwhile, reached a milestone of her own. After months of consistent treatment, her doctor delivered news that made her heart soar. Her condition had stabilized significantly. The relief was palpable as she sat with Henry in the doctor's office, holding his hand tightly. We're not out of the woods yet, the doctor cautioned, but the progress you've made is remarkable. Keep up the care, and you'll have a lot more good days ahead. On the way home, Mary leaned her head against Henry's shoulder as they sat on the bus. You know, she said softly, I didn't think I'd make it this far, but now I'm starting to dream again. Henry kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet determination. Then we'll dream together. We've earned it. Henry's story began to ripple beyond SpaceX. Local news outlets picked up on the program Elon Musk had started, featuring Henry as its centerpiece. The articles painted him as a man whose resilience and integrity had sparked a movement, inspiring others to rethink the value of experience and compassion. At first, Henry was uncomfortable with the attention. I'm no hero, he told a reporter one afternoon. I just did what anyone should do, helped someone who needed it. But as he saw the positive impact the stories had, he embraced his role as a mentor and advocate. He spoke at company meetings, community events, and even a local veterans center, sharing his journey and encouraging others to hold on to hope. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry and Mary sat together on their small balcony. The city stretched out before them, its lights twinkling like stars against the deepening sky. Do you ever think about that night? Mary asked, her voice thoughtful. Every day, Henry admitted. If I hadn't heard that cry for help, if I hadn't gone to the river. Mary placed her hand on his. You did. And because of that, we're here. Henry looked at her, his heart full. Kindness doesn't cost a thing, Mary, but it sure can change everything. As the night deepened, they sat in comfortable silence, their hands entwined. The bridge they had once called home was far behind them, but its lessons remained, a testament to the power of resilience, love, and the simple act of helping another. The anniversary of that fateful winter night had arrived, bringing with it a wave of reflection for Henry Carter. He stood in front of the mirror in his modest apartment, carefully straightening the tie that Mary had insisted he wear. His hands, once rough and calloused from years of labor, now moved with a steady confidence. Today wasn't just another workday. It was a day to give back. In the living room, Mary watched him with a proud smile. Though her frame was still slender, her cheeks had regained a healthy glow, and her voice carried a strength that had been absent for far too long. "You look handsome, Henry," she said teasingly. "You could give those young men at SpaceX a run for their money." Henry chuckled, adjusting his tie one last time. "I don't know about that, but I'll take the compliment." He walked over and kissed her forehead. "I'll be back by dinner. Don't wait up if I'm late." Mary squeezed his hand. "I know what today means to you. Take your time." The sun was low in the sky when Henry arrived at the bridge where his life had changed forever. He stood quietly for a moment, taking in the familiar sight of the concrete structure and the sound of the river rushing below. Memories flooded his mind, of the bitter cold, the fire he had struggled to keep alive, and the voice that had called for help in the night. He carried with him a backpack filled with supplies: granola bars, water bottles, warm socks, and small first aid kits. These were small things, but to someone living on the streets, they could mean everything. Henry had prepared these items with care, determined to make a difference for those who, like him, had once called this bridge home. As he began handing out the supplies, he stopped to speak with each person he encountered. He listened to their stories, offering words of encouragement and sharing bits of his own journey. To some, he offered practical advice. To others, he simply offered his time, a rare and invaluable gift. One young man, bundled in a threadbare jacket, looked at Henry with cautious curiosity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Henry crouched down to meet the man's gaze. "Because I've been where you are," he said simply, "and I know what it's like to feel invisible. But you're not. You matter. And it's never too late for life to surprise you." The young man nodded slowly, his expression softening. "Thanks. I guess I needed to hear that." Word of Henry's actions began to spread, not just among the homeless community, but also among his colleagues at SpaceX. His story, already a source of inspiration, took on a new dimension as he demonstrated that even small acts of kindness could create ripples of change. Elon Musk, always attentive to the impact of his employees, took notice. At the next company meeting, he shared Henry's recent efforts with the entire staff. Henry Carter reminded me, and I hope he reminds all of you, that innovation isn't just about technology. It's about people. It's about making the world a better place, one step at a time. The applause that followed was thunderous. Henry, seated modestly in the back of the room, felt his cheeks flush. He wasn't used to the spotlight, but he accepted it graciously, knowing the message was bigger than himself. Back at home, Mary greeted Henry with a warm embrace. They sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Henry told her about the people he had met that day and the small ways he had been able to help. Mary listened intently, her smile never wavering. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "you've created something bigger than you realize. It's not just about what Elon did for us. It's about what you've done for others. You've shown them that hope is real." Henry looked at her, his heart full. "I just did what I could, same as I always have." Mary placed her hand over his. "And that's why it matters." Every year, on the anniversary of that night, Henry returned to the bridge with his backpack and his stories. Each visit became a ritual, a way to honor the past while building a better future. He often found himself reflecting on Mary's words, the simple yet profound truth she had taught him. Kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it can change everything. As time went on, the impact of Henry's journey extended far beyond SpaceX and the bridge. Community programs inspired by his story flourished, and countless lives were touched by the simple act of believing in the value of every person, no matter their circumstances. And so, Henry Carter, once a man who had lost everything, became a symbol of resilience, compassion, and the enduring power of kindness. His story was a testament to the fact that it's never too late for life to surprise you, if you're willing to keep your heart open. Thank you for joining me for this story. I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel to stay updated on the heartfelt stories I'm passionate about sharing. Your support means the world to me and motivates me to keep creating. I'm truly grateful to have you on this journey with me.